Just die already, Mom. That's what my only son told me when I was lying in a hospital bed fighting for my life. Imagine raising a child, loving him with everything you've got, only to hear those words come out of his mouth. My name is Veronica Langston, but most people call me Vera. Before I go further, let me ask you something. What time are you watching this right now? Morning, afternoon, or maybe late at night? Drop it in the comments below. I want to see it because I need you to understand this isn't some made-up story. This is real. This happened to me. And it could happen to anyone. When I first heard the words, "You have cancer," my world shifted in ways I can't explain. I was 63 years old, and instead of support from the man I had built my life with, my husband Gerald walked out the door. He didn't wait, didn't even think twice. The minute the diagnosis came, he found an excuse to leave. Just like that, I was alone to face chemotherapy, surgeries, and the uncertainty of whether I'd survive. But don't get it twisted. I wasn't some helpless woman with nothing to her name. I had worked for decades to build myself up. I owned a studio and spa business, an upscale salon right in the heart of Buckhead. People came from all over Atlanta to get their hair, their nails, and their self-esteem lifted in my shop. The business thrived because I poured my soul into it, and I treated my staff like family. And beyond the salon, I had invested smartly, securing an estate in Cascade Heights worth about $5 million. That was my safety net, my hard-earned empire, and I thought it would one day serve as a legacy for my son. My son Brandon, he was my heart. From the day he was born, I tried to give him everything. The best schools I could afford, clothes, food, and the kind of attention a child deserves even when his father was too selfish to provide it. I carried him through nights of fever, scraped knees, bad grades, heartbreaks, the whole journey of motherhood. And even when he grew rebellious, even when his words cut me sharper than the disease in my body, I reminded myself, he's still my boy. But cancer changes more than your health. Changes the way people around you act. Suddenly you see who's willing to stand by you, and who was only there for the good times. The people you expect to hold your hand may be the very ones who let it go first. I never thought Gerald would be gone that quickly, and I never thought the son I loved would become the sharpest thorn in my side. Still, in those early days, I faced the treatments head-on. I signed the papers, scheduled the appointments at Emory University Hospital Midtown, and walked into every session determined to fight. My body was weak, yes, but my mind was stubborn. I told myself if God gave me breath, I wasn't going to waste it giving up. What I didn't know then was that the battle wasn't just with cancer. My real fight was going to come from inside my own family. And trust me, that fight would cut deeper than any chemotherapy needle ever could. Some enemies don't come dressed in red. They wear your favorite color, eat at your dinner table, and call themselves your best friend. But really, they're just waiting for the right moment to stab you where it hurts. Her name was Sabrina Cole. 10 years younger than me, energetic, funny, always dressed sharp. I met her years back when I was still building my salon business. She'd stop by, sometimes just to sit and chat while I worked, and over time she became a fixture in my life. I let her into spaces few others ever saw. My home in Cascade Heights, family dinners, even private conversations about Gerald's betrayal and the loneliness cancer made me feel. But what I didn't see then was the quiet envy in her eyes. When my business took off in Buckhead, when clients started driving luxury cars to my spa, when people mentioned my name in circles that Sabrina could only dream of entering, something inside her soured. Instead of celebrating me, she compared herself to me. And comparison, when it lives too long, turns into resentment. She positioned herself as my shadow, always near, always helping. She'd come over on quiet evenings with food, sit by my hospital bed like a sister, and tell me I wasn't alone. She was there so often that even Brandon began to see her as family. And that's where the betrayal began to take root. At first, I thought she was simply being a friend. She listened when I vented about the pain. She encouraged me when my hair began to fall. She promised to keep an eye on my business while I recovered. But behind those visits was something darker. She was learning my rhythms, gaining my trust, and inching her way into Brandon's life. Little by little, she blurred the line between best friend and something else. She was younger than me, closer to his age, and she knew exactly how to make him feel powerful. She flattered him when I had to correct him. She made him feel grown when I still tried to guide him. And soon, what started as whispers in the living room turned into a romantic entanglement I never saw coming. What burned the most wasn't just the relationship itself. It was the subtle manipulation. Sabrina didn't push Brandon directly against me. She just planted seeds. Little comments like, "Your mom works so hard, but she never lets you enjoy the fruits of her success." Or, "She's sick now. Maybe it's time you stepped up and took charge." She never said, "Hate her," but she gave him reasons to see me as an obstacle instead of a mother. Looking back, I realize now. Sabrina didn't need to tear me down with her own hands. All she had to do was lean on my son's weakness. His immaturity, his rebellion, his hunger for independence. And once that door cracked open, she slid right in. This was a woman I had once prayed with, cried with, laughed with. A woman who used to toast my business wins, saying how proud she was of me. And yet, deep inside, she couldn't stand the idea that I had built a life she never could. What I didn't know then was that this so-called friendship was about to turn into the deadliest betrayal of my life. Because Sabrina wasn't satisfied being my shadow anymore. She wanted to step into my spotlight, even if it meant destroying me to do it. You don't lose a son in one day. You lose him piece by piece. In the skipped phone calls, the rolled eyes, the disrespect that grows bolder every time you let it slide. Brandon had always been strong-willed, but after Sabrina slid into his life, it was like gasoline was poured on a flame I'd been trying to contain for years. I started noticing little things at first. He stopped checking in on me at the hospital, where most sons would sit by their mother's side during chemo, hold her hand, or at least call. Brandon was too busy. Busy with work, busy with friends, busy with Sabrina. When he did show up, his attitude was sharp. He'd look at me in that hospital bed and shake his head like I'd done something wrong just by being sick. Once, when I tried to talk about how painful the treatments were, he smirked and said, "Well, you did this to yourself. Always stressing, always overworking." Imagine hearing that from the child you raised with love. It didn't stop there. My salon in Buckhead had always been my pride. But while I was fighting for my life, I left some of the day-to-day in Brandon's hands. Shauna, my loyal manager, would call me and whisper about how he was treating the staff. He barked orders, demanded respect he hadn't earned, and even pocketed cash from the daily register when he thought nobody was looking. When clients complained, he brushed them off, saying, "My mom won't even be here much longer anyway. I'm about to take over." The disrespect ran deeper at home too. Bills I trusted him to handle went unpaid. He moved furniture around my estate like it was already his. And worst of all, he mocked me for trying to keep control. "Why are you worrying about money, Mom? You can't take it with you when you're gone." Those words cut deeper than the needles in my arm. And right behind him, like a shadow feeding the fire, was Sabrina. She had become his biggest cheerleader, but not in a way that lifted him up, in a way that turned him against me. She'd whisper things like, "Your mom's old, Brandon. She's sick, selfish, and holding on to things that should be yours by now. If she really cared, she'd pass the torch instead of wasting everything on treatments." She knew exactly how to stroke his ego. When I tried to correct him, she'd tell him he was a man now, that he didn't need to keep listening to an old woman stuck in her ways. Slowly, I became the enemy in my own home. The saddest part. Brandon didn't need much pushing. His selfishness had been there all along. Sabrina just gave it permission to bloom. Where a son should have seen his mother struggle and stepped closer, mine pulled further away. He didn't see my fight with cancer as something to rally behind. He saw it as an opportunity to seize what I'd built. I had spent decades building a legacy I thought he would one day cherish. But by then, I was beginning to realize Brandon wasn't looking at me as a mother anymore. He was looking at me as an obstacle standing in the way of his inheritance. Nothing exposes a person's heart faster than money. The moment Brandon smelled access to mine, he stopped pretending to be my son and started acting like a thief. Sabrina was turning 50, and Brandon, blinded by lust and ego, promised her a birthday no one in Atlanta would forget. He told her he'd whisk her away to the Ritz-Carlton, Grand Cayman, White Sands champagne dinners, private suites overlooking the ocean. The kind of trip men twice his age save years to afford. But Brandon had no savings, no real plan. The only vault he had access to was me. He looked at my accounts the way a burglar looks at a window left open. The withdrawals started small, a few thousand here, a few thousand there. I assumed they were for bills, or to help with something at the salon. But within weeks, my 7-figure savings had been drained down to a fraction. By the time I realized it, nearly everything I'd put away for my treatments and future was gone. Meanwhile, Shauna, my salon manager, called me in tears. She said Brandon had stormed into the spa like he owned the place. He berated employees, cut hours for staff he didn't like, and even skimmed from the daily registers. Clients who had trusted my business for years started complaining. Instead of treating them with respect, he dismissed them. My mom won't even be around much longer. This will be my place soon. Hearing that broke something in me. That was my name on the door. My life's work. And my son treated it like a plaything he could run into the ground. It didn't stop there. Brandon had begun circling my estate like a vulture. Without a word to me, he contacted a realtor and quietly listed my house in Cascade Heights for sale. A home worth millions, a home where I had poured memories, where I raised him, and he treated it like a quick cash out. I found out only because one of my neighbors spotted a listing online and called me. "Vera, are you moving? I saw your estate up for sale." My heart sank. I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for my life, while my only child was plotting to sell the very roof over my head. All the while, Brandon was busy showing off. New clothes, expensive dinners, whispers about an upcoming trip. He flaunted it like he'd finally arrived, when in reality, it was my sweat, my years, my savings funding every step. And right beside him was Sabrina, smiling, proud, letting herself be spoiled by the money she knew wasn't his to give. The cruelest part. He didn't see me anymore as his mother, sick and in need of care. He saw me as an ATM with an expiration date. His plan was simple. Raid the accounts, gut the business, sell the house, and live the high life, all while I was left to wither in a hospital bed. At the time, I didn't know the full extent of what he'd done. But what I did know was this. Brandon had stopped waiting for my inheritance. He wanted it while I was still alive. And for Sabrina's 50th birthday, he was willing to steal everything from me just to prove he could play the role of a wealthy man. I spent 2 grueling months at Emory University Hospital Midtown undergoing chemotherapy. Day after day, I walked into that sterile room, sat in that recliner, and let poison drip into my veins in the hope that it would kill the cancer before it killed me. My hair thinned, my appetite disappeared, my body shriveled, but I kept telling myself, this too shall pass. But the loneliness was unbearable. Brandon, my only son, came to see me just 3 times in all those weeks. 3. And even those visits were short, filled with impatience, like he was checking something off a list rather than being present with his mother. He'd stand there with his arms crossed, scrolling through his phone, sighing like he had better places to be. And each time he left, I felt more invisible. The nurses noticed. One of them leaned close to me one day and whispered, "Ms. Langston, you deserve better support. You shouldn't be going through this alone." Even the staff at the hospital, strangers to me, could see what my own child refused to show. Basic care, basic love. While I lay weak in that hospital bed, Brandon was living another life entirely. He wasn't grieving, he wasn't worried, he wasn't praying. He was posting. On social media, he flaunted his new lifestyle. Dinners at steakhouses, nights out at lounges, shopping trips, all plastered with smiles and hashtags. And right beside him, in every other photo, was Sabrina. The same woman I once called my best friend now paraded herself as his new love. They looked like a couple on the rise, enjoying their moment in Atlanta's spotlight. She laughed in the photos, head tilted back, jewelry glinting under restaurant lights. He posted captions about treating my queen, all while I was alone trying to fight for my life. What tore me apart wasn't just the betrayal, it was the contrast. My veins ached from chemo needles, my stomach churned from medication, my heart hurt from abandonment. And yet the child I gave everything to was out whining and dining with a woman I once trusted most. I remember one night, scrolling quietly through my phone between treatments, when I stumbled on a photo of Brandon kissing Sabrina on the cheek at her birthday dinner. She was glowing, he was grinning, and the caption read, "Celebrating my everything. Big trips coming soon." I stared at that screen for what felt like hours, wondering how a son could erase his mother so easily, how a friend could betray me so boldly. Those 2 months taught me something. People reveal who they really are when you're too weak to fight back. And in my weakness, Brandon showed me he had no interest in being my son anymore. He had chosen Sabrina, the lifestyle, the money, anything but me. But what he didn't know was this. I wasn't done yet. The cancer was in my body, yes, but the fight in me wasn't gone. And when the day came for me to take my life back, I'd remember every empty hospital visit, every lonely night, every photo he posted with my so-called friend. Because the pain they left me in wasn't going to break me. It was going to fuel me. Some words don't just hurt, they carve themselves into your chest like a scar you'll carry forever. And the day my son told me to die, I felt something inside me snap. I remember it clear as if it happened 5 minutes ago. The hospital room was quiet that afternoon. The floor dripped steadily, nurses moved softly in the hallway, and for once I had allowed myself to drift into a half-sleep, hoping to escape the nausea. Then my phone rang. When I saw Brandon's name flash across the screen, my heart lifted. Maybe he was finally checking on me. Maybe he remembered I was his mother. I answered with a weak but hopeful hello. His voice came cold, sharp, without a hint of compassion. "Just die already, Mom. Stop wasting money on chemo. I've got better things to do with that money." Before I could process the words, before I could even breathe, he hung up. No pause, no explanation, no room for me to reply. Just silence. I sat there gripping the phone, my hand trembling. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. For all the pain cancer had caused me, nothing cut as deep as those words from the child I carried, the child I fed, the child I once believed would stand by me when everyone else left. Tears came, but they weren't the soft kind. They were hot, angry, uncontrollable. I cried for the years I spent working double shifts so he could have school supplies. I cried for the nights I went without so he could have new clothes. I cried for every sacrifice I made that he now dismissed like it meant nothing. But when the tears dried, something shifted. I wasn't just a mother in pain anymore. I was a woman betrayed, and a woman determined. Brandon's words didn't just wound me, they woke me up. They told me loud and clear that the boy I raised had chosen his path. He saw me not as his mother, but as an obstacle to the life he wanted. And if he could speak death over me while I was fighting for life, then I had no reason to keep hoping he'd change. I knew from that moment, this betrayal would not stand. That was the day I stopped clinging to the idea of who I thought Brandon was. I accepted the truth of who he had become. And in that acceptance I found clarity. If he wanted me gone, if he wanted everything I had worked for, then he was about to learn just how strong I could still be. Because I wasn't going to just survive cancer. I was going to survive him. And when I came out on the other side, I would make sure the same voice that told me to just die would one day beg me for mercy. Sometimes blood betrays you, but love you poured into someone else's child comes back to save your life. After that phone call with Brandon, I sat for hours replaying his words. Every scenario, every excuse, every hope I once held onto for him dissolved in that moment. And as I lay there, weak from treatment but sharper in spirit than ever before, one name rose in my heart: Miles Cole. Miles was Sabrina's son. You'd think that fact alone would make him just as poisoned as his mother. But from the time he was young, I saw something different in him. Where Sabrina was selfish and envious, Miles was thoughtful. Where she schemed, he studied. I gave him advice over the years, pulled him aside when I saw him drifting, and reminded him to hold on to integrity no matter what his mother did. He once asked me, "Ms. Vera, why do you even keep my mom as a friend when she hurts you so often?" And I told him, because sometimes God gives you a hard bone to chew to strengthen your teeth. He never forgot that. And maybe that's why he stayed close to me even after growing estranged from Sabrina herself. By the time my world started to unravel, Miles had already built himself into a respected young lawyer in Decatur. He didn't have wealth, but he had knowledge. He had discipline. And most importantly, he had loyalty. That evening I picked up the phone and called him. My voice was weak, but the words came out steady. "Miles, I need you." He didn't hesitate. Within an hour, he was sitting by my hospital bed, suit jacket folded neatly over the chair, notepad in hand. His eyes carried the same concern I once wished to see in my own son. I explained everything. The savings drained, the business staff complaining, the estate listed for sale without my consent, and finally, the cruel words Brandon had thrown at me. Miles listened without interruption. No shock, no dramatics. Just the calm, focused gaze of a man who understood betrayal but didn't let it rattle him. When I finished, he closed his notebook slowly and said, "Ms. Vera, you've carried me like a son when mine wouldn't. Now let me carry you." I can't explain the relief I felt in that moment. After weeks of abandonment, manipulation, and heartbreak, I finally had someone in my corner who wasn't out to use me. Someone who saw me as more than a bank account, more than a burden. He leaned forward, voice low but firm. "Brandon might think he's clever, but he's left a trail. We're going to follow it. Every dollar, every lie, every document. We'll uncover it all." In that instant, my despair shifted into hope. Not because I thought the fight would be easy, but because I realized I wasn't fighting alone anymore. Miles had chosen to stand with me against his own mother's schemes, against my son's betrayal, against the very forces that tried to strip me of dignity. I had lost Gerald when sickness came. I had lost Brandon to greed and lust. But I hadn't lost everyone. In Miles, I found proof that love doesn't always come from where you expect. Sometimes the child you raised in spirit, not in blood, is the one who saves you when your own flesh turns against you. And from that night forward, the war for my life, my legacy, and my name truly began. Betrayal is like rot. It starts small, but when you peel back the layers, you realize it's been eating away at everything you built. With Miles on my side, the first step was simple. Find the truth. Not the stories Brandon spun, not the excuses Sabrina whispered, but the raw facts. Facts don't lie. Miles came to my hospital room one evening with a stack of papers and a laptop. Sitting beside him was a face I didn't expect but welcomed like family. Tiana Brooks Daniels, Brandon's ex-girlfriend. Tiana had long moved on with her own life, married and happy, but she never stopped caring about me. In fact, she'd checked on me more times during my illness than my own son. When Miles told her what was happening, she didn't hesitate. She showed up ready to help. "Miss Vera was good to me when I was nobody," she said softly. "If Brandon won't protect her, then I will." The three of us became a quiet team. Miles handled the legal digging, I provided whatever access I could, and Tiana lent the personal knowledge only someone close to Brandon would know. It didn't take long for the picture to emerge. Miles pulled my bank records line by line. What should have been a healthy 7-figure balance was now bleeding red. Tens of thousands withdrawn in cash, unexplained transfers to accounts Brandon had opened under his name. He wasn't even subtle about it. Luxury purchases, resort payments, jewelry, all laid out in black and white. Next came my property. Miles discovered that my Cascade Heights estate had been listed on the market, without my signature, without my approval. The documents were forged, my name sloppily scribbled in a way that any expert could spot as fake. Brandon was preparing to sell the very roof over my head while I was lying in a hospital bed. And then there was the salon. Shauna, my manager, nearly cried when Miles reached out. She told him how Brandon barged in like a tyrant, berating staff, cutting shifts, pocketing cash from the register. Employees who had been loyal to me for years now considered leaving because they couldn't stand his arrogance. "He told us," Shauna said bitterly. "It'll all be mine soon anyway. Why should I care how you feel?" Every testimony, every bank slip, every digital trail pointed to one thing. Brandon wasn't just disrespectful. He was a thief. He was gutting my life piece by piece, confident I'd never be strong enough to stop him. As I listened to Miles lay it out, a mixture of emotions washed over me. Anger, grief, disbelief. But above it all was a strange sense of calm. 'Cause now I had evidence. Proof. For the first time, Brandon's betrayal wasn't just something I felt in my spirit. It was something I could see in ink and numbers. Tiana added her part too. She remembered details from when she dated him. Shady comments about selling company information, late-night bragging about how his mom's money was his golden ticket. She gave Miles old texts and emails she had saved, conversations that revealed just how long Brandon had been planning to live off my name. Piece by piece, the mask was stripped away. Lying in that hospital bed, weak from chemo, I should have felt powerless. But instead I felt the first flicker of power returning. Because with Miles' sharp mind, Tiana's courage, and Shauna's testimony, we were building a case. A case that would not only expose Brandon but protect what was rightfully mine. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. We had uncovered the rot. But the deeper we dug, the uglier it was going to get. Miles came to see me one morning with a look on his face I'll never forget. He wasn't just tired, he was furious. He placed a folder on the small hospital table beside me and slid it toward me without saying a word. Inside were screenshots, bank receipts, and a website page with my picture plastered across the top. Brandon had created a fake charity. He called it the Langston Cancer Recovery Fund. He used photos of me, bald and frail in that hospital bed, without my permission. He wrote a heart-tugging story about how I was too weak to work, and how my family needed support to cover my medical bills. Then he sent that link out to my former clients, old business partners, even friends I hadn't spoken to in years. And they gave. Thousands of dollars poured into that account. Not 1 cent of it ever reached me. Miles had tracked the account straight to Brandon's name. Every donation, every transfer went directly to him. I could barely breathe as I flipped through the pages. People who once trusted me were unknowingly lining his pockets. And the worst part, he wasn't even using the money to cover bills. He was funneling it into his trip with Sabrina and showering her with gifts. The betrayal stung deeper than anything so far. My reputation, my image, my illness. He had turned it into a scam. I thought of Valerie Kemp, one of my wealthiest salon clients who had always been generous with me. She had donated over $10,000 to that fund, thinking she was helping me survive. Now her kindness had been pocketed by my son, who laughed behind the scenes at how easy it was. As if that wasn't enough, Tiana added another dagger. She returned one evening with her phone in hand, scrolling through old messages she had once saved. They weren't sweet nothings or romantic memories. They were evidence. In those texts, Brandon bragged about selling confidential data from his accounting firm. Easy side money, he called it. These fools pay thousands for a file, and they'll never know it came from me. He even joked that one day he wouldn't need his job at all because Mom's name is the real gold mine. I sat there listening, my stomach tight, my heart pounding. The boy I raised to know right from wrong wasn't just greedy. He was criminal. He used my cancer as a business, my name as a front, and his company as a black market. Miles looked at me with steady eyes. Ms. Vera, this isn't just family drama anymore. This is fraud. This is theft. If we press forward, he's not just going to lose your money. He's going to face the law. For a long moment I said nothing. I just let the weight of it settle. My own son had become the architect of my public humiliation and the thief of my private security. But as painful as it was, I also knew something else. This gave us leverage. He had left trails everywhere. A charity account with his name on it, screenshots of his own bragging, stolen corporate data. He thought he was untouchable, but he had made himself a target. That day, I stopped seeing Brandon as simply a wayward child. I saw him for what he was, a con artist who had chosen to destroy me for profit. And once you see someone clearly, you stop making excuses for them. Miles closed the folder and said, "This is enough to bring him down. But it's only the beginning." And he was right. Because the deeper we dug, the more Brandon's empire of lies began to crumble. While I was lying in a hospital bed with poison dripping into my veins, my son was lying on a beach with champagne in his hand. That's the kind of betrayal you don't forget. By the time Miles and I uncovered the fake charity and the stolen funds, Brandon and Sabrina were already gone. They had packed their bags, boarded a flight, and vanished into paradise. The destination. The Ritz-Carlton, Grand Cayman. 5-star suites, ocean views and private cabanas. I didn't need to imagine what they were doing. Brandon made sure the whole world could see. Photos of them sipping cocktails under palm trees. Videos of Sabrina twirling in designer dresses, laughing while Brandon held the camera. Posts bragging about living the good life, while hashtags about luxury, loyalty, and love mocked everything I was going through. Each image cut like a blade. Not because I envied their vacation, but because I knew exactly how it was being paid for. My money. My business. Every smile on their faces was bought with the sacrifices I had made over decades. What they didn't know, as they toasted glasses of champagne on the sand, was that the walls were already closing in. Miles had filed motions that froze my savings accounts, cutting Brandon off from further withdrawals. The forged property listing on my estate had triggered scrutiny, and the realtor who had unknowingly posted it was now cooperating with investigators. And thanks to Tiana's texts, Brandon's accounting firm had opened an internal probe into stolen client data. Subpoenas were being prepared. His employer wasn't asking if he was guilty, only how much he had stolen. But there he was, parading Sabrina through beachfront restaurants, buying her gifts from boutiques, handing her the illusion of wealth he never earned. To her, it looked like Brandon was finally the man she had always wanted. Powerful, generous, unstoppable. To him it felt like he had won. Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, I watched from my hospital bed as Miles assembled piece after piece of evidence. I couldn't eat much, I couldn't move around, but I could still think. And I knew one thing. Brandon's joy was temporary. He thought this trip was the start of his empire. But in truth, it was the peak before the fall. While he laid his head on silk pillows in a suite overlooking the Caribbean, papers were being signed in Atlanta that would strip him of everything he thought he'd gained. And when he finally came back home, he wouldn't be returning to the mother he wished dead. He'd be returning to subpoenas, locked accounts, and a city ready to show him just how fragile his so-called empire really was. Life has a way of humbling people fast. One day you're sipping champagne on a beach, the next day you're choking on subpoenas. Brandon came back from Grand Cayman strutting like a man who thought he'd conquered the world. He walked through Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in his new designer shoes, Sabrina trailing behind him with shopping bags. To them, the trip had been a victory lap, proof that their choices, their betrayal had paid off. But what waited for him in Atlanta wasn't glory. It was ruin. The first blow landed the moment he walked into his office at the accounting firm. His manager, Kenneth Bolton, was waiting with HR and security by his side. Brandon was called into a meeting where evidence of data theft and client leaks were laid out in black and white. Tiana's old texts had matched up with irregularities in the company's records. He didn't get a chance to talk his way out of it. He was immediately suspended pending investigation. His access badge was taken, his desk locked. His colleagues watching as the once cocky employee left the building with his head down. But that was just the beginning. When he tried to withdraw money from the accounts he had been bleeding dry for months, the transactions were denied. Miles had secured freezes on all my savings, cutting Brandon off completely. Suddenly, the endless stream of cash he thought he controlled was gone. His luxury spending spigot had been turned off. Then came the business. Brandon drove to my Buckhead salon as if he still owned the place, ready to pull money from the registers like before. But Shauna and the staff, backed by legal documents Miles had prepared, stood firm. His access to salon funds was revoked, and staff who once trembled under his temper now looked him dead in the eye with contempt. The business was mine again, and Brandon had no authority left there. Still, he might have survived the humiliation privately if not for what happened next. In a city like Atlanta, word spreads fast. A group of my former business partners, the very people Brandon had scammed with his fake cancer fund, confronted him at a local restaurant. I wasn't there to see it, but Shauna described it to me in detail. They cornered him mid-meal, demanding answers, raising their voices so loudly the entire dining room fell silent. One man slammed the printed charity page down on his table and shouted, "You stole from me using your sick mother's name." Another woman cried as she listed the thousands she had donated, money she thought was keeping me alive. Brandon froze, stammering excuses, but no one wanted to hear them. Diners whispered, cameras came out, and before long, he was forced to leave under a storm of shame. The son I raised to walk tall now slunk out of a restaurant like a thief caught red-handed. From my hospital bed I heard every detail. And though it hurt to know how far he had fallen, I couldn't deny a grim satisfaction. Brandon wanted to erase me. Instead, he was the one being erased. From his job, from my accounts, from my business, from the respect of the very people he tried to exploit. His return from paradise wasn't a homecoming. It was the beginning of his downfall. And deep inside, I knew it was only the first wave. Money can buy you trips, clothes, and fleeting attention. But it can't buy back a name once it's stained. And for Sabrina, shame was the only gift left after the party ended. By the time Brandon's world began to collapse, the whispers had already reached Sabrina. At first, she tried to brush it off, telling people Brandon's troubles had nothing to do with her. But Atlanta is a city that talks, and soon her name was being mentioned in every conversation. She was known not just as my friend of decades, but now as the woman who had slept with my son while I fought cancer in a hospital bed. The woman who helped him squander money that wasn't his. The woman who smiled in photos while I lay alone, fighting to survive. Her church was the first to turn cold. Where once she walked in smiling, shaking hands, and sitting proudly in the second pew, now people avoided her gaze. I heard from others that some members even whispered prayers out loud when she passed, not for her well-being, but for protection from her spirit of betrayal. Neighbors followed suit. People she'd lived among for years no longer waved. Invitations stopped. Doors closed quietly when she walked by. The same streets she once strutted proudly down became a gauntlet of silence and stares. But the deepest wound came from within her own home. Miles, her son, the one she had raised in name but never in spirit, finally had enough. Standing in front of family, friends, and colleagues, he said the words Sabrina never expected to hear. "I disown you. From this day forward, you're not my mother." The irony wasn't lost on me. I had poured into Miles, shown him care his own mother never gave, and in the end, he stood by me while publicly cutting ties with her. Sabrina, who once thought she could steal my place in my son's life, ended up losing her own child forever. I wasn't there to see her reaction when he said it, but those who were told me her face crumpled. Pride, arrogance, denial, all of it cracked in that moment. For the first time, she couldn't laugh it off or hide behind Brandon. She was stripped bare in front of everyone. At 50 years old, Sabrina was disgraced. No criminal charges came her way. She hadn't left the paper trails Brandon had. But the punishment she received was worse in some ways. The humiliation never left her side. She became the woman people whispered about at grocery stores, the cautionary tale told in hushed tones at dinner tables. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore. She packed up what she could and left the neighborhood she had called home for decades. She slipped away not in triumph, not in pride, but in shame, carrying the weight of betrayal that could never be undone. Sabrina once thought she could build herself up by tearing me down. But all she managed to do was destroy her own name. And as she vanished into obscurity, I realized something important. Sometimes you don't have to lift a finger against your enemies. Sometimes their own choices bury them deeper than you ever could. Cancer tried to take my body. Betrayal tried to take my spirit. But God had the final say over both. The chemo that once left me so weak I could barely lift a spoon began to show results. Slowly, my scans improved, my energy returned, and the doctors used words I hadn't heard in months. "You're stabilizing." My hair, thin and fragile, started to grow back. Food didn't taste like metal anymore. I could walk around my house without holding onto every wall. Through it all, Pastor Leonard never stopped visiting. He prayed at my bedside, not with empty theatrics, but with quiet conviction. He reminded me that while cancer was in my body, it didn't own my soul. Those prayers became fuel. They gave me peace when my nights were restless, courage when my body screamed for relief. As my strength returned, so did my focus. My life wasn't over, it was being rebuilt. The first victory came with my salon. Shauna, my manager, stood like a soldier when Brandon tried to ruin everything. With Miles' legal support and the staff's loyalty, they kept the business alive in my absence. By the time I returned, the spa had steadied. Loyal clients who had left during Brandon's reign began to trickle back, whispering, "We're glad you're here again, Ms. Vera." Sitting in my Buckhead shop, smelling the familiar scents of hair products and polish, I felt like I was home again. Next was my estate. Brandon's forged documents had threatened to rip my Cascade Heights home away, but Miles secured it legally, brick by brick, paper by paper. Every false signature was exposed, every fraudulent attempt reversed. The deed was once again in my name alone. No more fear of losing the roof over my head. No more wondering if the walls around me were safe. That house was mine, and I could finally rest within it without anxiety gnawing at me. Financial stability followed. With Brandon cut off, the bleeding stopped. Frozen accounts thawed back under my control. Staff made sure the salon produced steady income, and investments I had thought were gone remained intact. I would never get back the money Brandon wasted, but I still had enough to live comfortably, and enough to know my hard work hadn't been in vain. I often sat quietly during that season, thinking about everything I had endured. The sickness, the abandonment, the theft, the humiliation. By all accounts, I should have been broken. But instead, I was rising again, stronger, wiser, and no longer blind to the people I once trusted. Healing isn't just about the body. It's about reclaiming everything that betrayal tries to steal from you. Your dignity, your purpose, your peace. And as I regained mine piece by piece, I knew one truth. This restoration wasn't just survival. It was preparation. Because while my health and home were being restored, Brandon's downfall was still unfolding. And the same son who told me to just die already was about to face the justice he thought would never reach him. By the time Brandon's case reached court, the evidence against him wasn't just a pile. It was a mountain. Fraudulent solicitations tied to that fake cancer charity. Forged documents with his sloppy attempt at my signature. Corporate theft traced through digital fingerprints and bank transfers. Every scheme he thought was invisible was now printed on paper for all to see. Walking into that courtroom, I felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Sorrow because no mother ever dreams of seeing her child in chains. Resolve because I knew he had put himself there. The prosecutors worked like craftsmen, piece by piece building the story of Brandon's betrayal. They didn't need to exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. And then came the testimony that cut through the room like glass. Tiana, his ex-girlfriend, took the stand. Calm, steady, but with fire in her eyes. She brought out the text messages Brandon had once sent her, bragging about selling his company's confidential data. She read them word for word, her voice echoing through the courtroom. Easy side money. These fools pay thousands for a file, and they'll never know it came from me. The jury listened. Brandon sat frozen. There was no denying it was his number, his words, his ego laid bare. Then came the forged property listings. Miles himself stood firm, presenting the documents Brandon had faked in an attempt to sell my Cascade Heights estate. His legal training, his precision. It left no room for Brandon to hide. The judge leaned forward, eyebrows raised, as Miles walked them through how my name had been crudely forged and how Brandon had tried to push it through. The prosecution tied it all together with the fraudulent cancer fund. Former business partners, clients, even neighbors testified that Brandon had contacted them, begging for donations to save his mother's life. They recounted how they had given thousands, only to later discover that I never saw a penny of it. Watching their faces filled with anger and humiliation, I felt a strange mix of grief and vindication. Piece after piece, the puzzle came together until the picture was undeniable. Brandon wasn't a misguided son. He was a criminal who had exploited his own mother's illness for profit. I sat silently, my hands clasped in my lap, listening as the walls closed in on the boy I once held in my arms. There was no rescue this time, no excuse to shield him, no prayer that could erase what he had done. He had built his own downfall brick by brick, and now the weight of it was crashing down. By the end of the trial, the judge's words were clear. Brandon was guilty. Guilty of fraud, guilty of theft, guilty of forgery. His arrogance had turned into shame, his bravado into silence. And though my heart ached, I knew justice had been served. Because sometimes the hardest lesson a mother can learn is that love doesn't mean shielding someone from the consequences of their choices. Brandon had chosen betrayal. Now he would live with its cost. People think revenge means blood, shouting, or chaos. But the sweetest revenge doesn't make a sound. It's watching the people who tried to bury you get swallowed by the holes they dug for themselves. The day the judge read Brandon's sentence, the courtroom was silent. Years in prison. No appeals that could save him. No loopholes left to crawl through. My son, the same boy I once carried, the same boy who told me to just die already, was led away in shackles. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. For the first time he had no words, no bravado, no smirk. Just silence. Sabrina wasn't in much better shape. She had managed to avoid handcuffs, but disgrace is its own kind of prison. With her name ruined, her neighbors rejecting her, and her own son Miles publicly disowning her, she became a ghost in her own life. No church welcomed her. No family dinners saved her seat. She slipped into the background of Atlanta, a woman who once flaunted luxury but now carried only whispers of shame. At 50 years old, her only companion was regret. And me. I walked free. My health was improving every day. The chemo that once drained me had done its job. My strength was returning. I could smile again, laugh again, breathe again without feeling like I was carrying death in my chest. My salon was thriving, my estate was secured, and my finances were steady once more. Had lost time, yes. Had lost tears, yes. But I had not lost myself. That was the victory. Not by raising my hand against them, not by screaming or begging or chasing. My revenge came through patience, truth, and persistence. Every lie Brandon spun collapsed under evidence. Every plan Sabrina plotted crumbled into humiliation. And I didn't have to lift a sword. When I look back now, I realize that the greatest revenge wasn't just seeing them fall. It was reclaiming everything they thought I would lose. My dignity, my health, my peace. I walked out of that courtroom stronger than I'd ever been, with my head high, knowing my story wasn't ending in tragedy. It was ending in triumph. And as for Brandon and Sabrina, they became the lesson. A living reminder that betrayal has a price. And no matter how carefully you think you've covered your tracks, the truth always finds you. My revenge wasn't violent. It was meticulous. It was patient. And in the end it was absolute.